Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Workers' Comp Introduction to Ownership. I'm Brian Pettiville, past chairman of the IIABCal Emerging Leaders Committee, and I'll be filling in for Rob Oates today. With us today is Tim Beery of the Workers' Compensation Insurance Rating Bureau of California. The WCRB has partnered with the IIABCal Emerging Leaders to offer these free webinars to help agents and brokers increase their understanding of workers' comp insurance in California. Tim has been with the WCIRB for 12 years and has presented several WCIRB seminars about ownership impact on experience rating. For today's webinar, we've muted your phones to eliminate all background noise, but you can still ask questions throughout the webinar, and you do that by typing them in the right-hand GoToMeeting bar at any time. And at the end, we'll go ahead and address all those questions. So with that, we'll let Tim take it away.
Thanks, Brian. Well, I'm glad everybody could join us today. Thank you for signing up for this webinar. We hope that you'll get a lot of a better understanding of ownership today. I think many agents and brokers understand that classification is an important topic. Experience rating or experience modifications are important, and probably lesser known is that ownership is also very important. The ownership of a business, combinability, changes in ownership. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so today's presentation, we're going to discuss a few topics: how to determine ownership of an entity for experience rating purposes, when separate entities are combinable on the same policy and or for experience rating purposes, and how a change in ownership impacts the experience modification. Some of the references and resources available to you here. We're going to be discussing the regulations that are found in the experience rating plan. So anything related to ownership is going to be in the experience rating plan, and that's available on the WCRB website under publications and filings if you want to open a copy. We'll be referring to the ERP throughout this presentation. Also, Form 601, which is used for reporting changes in ownership to the WCRB, is available on our website under data reporting on ownership changes. So let's start by taking a look at what is an entity. The ownership is determined based on an insured's legal entity type. So here's a list of entities as defined by Section 2, Rule 5 of the Experience Rating Plan. So an entity includes an individual, a partnership, either a general partnership or a limited partnership, a joint venture, limited liability partnership, corporation, limited liability company or LLC, unincorporated association, and trust or other fiduciary operation. This definition is in the Experience Rating Plan under Section 2, Rule 5. So the ERP defines how to determine the ownership for each type of entity. For an individual, the ownership is the sole proprietor, or the individual as a 100% owner. For a partnership, and this includes limited partnerships and limited liability partnerships, the general partners have equal shares. For a joint venture, the joint venturers have equal shares of ownership. For a limited liability company or an LLC, all members have equal shares of ownership. And this includes both managing and non-managing members for the LLC. So this is how ownership is determined for these types of entities. And these definitions can be found in the Experience Rating Plan under Section 2, Rule 9. Now, it's important to note that for certain types of entities, the ownership for experience rating purposes might be different from how ownership is determined in the business world. For example, common mistakes are made with partnerships and LLCs. And so, for example, let's take a partnership. In the business world, it might be set up with two partners and they have 60-40 ownership. However, for experience rating purposes, based on the definitions of the ERP, if there are two partners, each of them get equal shares of ownership, and so the ownership is actually 50-50 for experience rating. Same is true for LLC. So it's important to know how to determine the ownership for each type of entity based on the rules of the ERP. Less common entities, but here is how to determine the ownership for those. For a trust, the trustees own equal shares. However, if the grantor retains control of the trust, then the grantor is the owner. For bankruptcies and receiverships, the trustees or the receivers own equal shares. But if you have a case where the entity retains possession of the assets referred to as debtor in possession, then the ownership is determined as if the as if it's not being operated under the trusteeship or the receivership, essentially that the debtor in possession is the owner. For all other entities, which includes corporations, associations, nonprofit organizations, etc., if the entity has issued stock, then the ownership is determined by the voting stock. If the entity does not have any voting stock, then the members own equal shares. If the entity does not have voting stock and has no members, then the board of directors, the members of the board of directors own equal shares. So that's how you determine ownership for different kinds of entities. And this is an important first step because anytime you review combination of entities or changes in ownership, the first step is always determining the ownership of all entities that are involved. Let's start with combination of entities. What are combinable entities? You may have heard that term before. So when are two or more entities combined for experience rating? We refer to Section 4, Rule 2 of the ERP, which states, separate entities shall be combined for experience rating purposes when the same person or persons owns a majority interest in each of the entities. So the key is majority interest or greater than 50% common ownership. And note that it can be the same person or persons who own a majority interest in each entity. So if there are multiple common owners with a percentage interest in each entity, then add them up. And if it totals more than 50% for each entity, then the entities are combinable. Combinable entities may be insured on the same policy or on separate policies. That's fine. However, entities that share majority common ownership will receive a single experience modification using the combined payroll and claims data. So if entities are combinable and they're written on separate policies, they're going to be in the same file number for experience rating. They're going to receive one experience modification that will apply to both policies. Now, a common thought or a common reaction when we first discuss combination of entities is, well, I've got these two operations, these two businesses, they're very different. They have very different classifications. They're different industries. However, keep in mind that combination of entities is based on ownership. It has nothing to do with the type of business. So you can have a grocery store and a bowling alley, and if you are majority owner in both of those, they're going to be combined, and all of that data will be used for your experience modification. The combination of entities rule applies to almost every entity with the exception of trusts, bankruptcies, and receiverships. And in general, those entities can't be combined with any other entity except for specific circumstances that are indicated in Section 4, Rule 2 of the ERP. So next, we'll cover another major impact of ownership on experience rating, which is when an entity undergoes a change in ownership. And this is probably, we're trying to build here, so we start with how to determine ownership, then we talk about combination of entities, so we're kind of doing building blocks. So definitely we're going to end with the heaviest concept. So if everyone can stick with me, I'll try my best to keep it light this morning. And if you have additional questions, you can always type those in. So for a change in ownership, and I'm sure everyone has one in mind that they either have right now or that they've dealt with in the past. But for a change in ownership, there are two sides that we look at. So let's start by taking a look at how a change in ownership affects the seller. There's the seller side and the buyer side. Now the seller's experience will follow them as long as they continue to have California operations. So there's no question there. Does the experience follow the seller? Yes, as long as they have California operations. So a common misconception is that the seller thinks that they can shed their experience by getting rid of one of their businesses that may not have favorable claims history. But that's not the case. If the seller owns two entities and sells one of them, the payroll and claims data for both entities up until the date of the sale will continue to be used in the seller's experience modification. Now, the WCRB analyzes the change in ownership to determine whether or not the seller's experience should be used in the buyer's experience modification. So that's what the analysis is all about that we're going to discuss in the next several slides. So as long as the seller has operations, their experience stays with them. You can't shed your experience. So now let's take a look at a tour of the process that we go through for reviewing a change in ownership. So here's a flow chart to try to detail out the multi-step process that we go through when reviewing a change in ownership. And each change in ownership is reviewed on a case-by-case basis, especially for experience-rated employers. If a change in ownership occurs, we go through these steps and take a look at the application of the rules of the experience rating plan to each individual scenario. So the steps involve determining whether the change in ownership is nominal or material. We're going to talk a little bit about that. It also includes determining whether it's a total sale or a partial sale. We're going to define what that means. And it may involve the review of payroll records. So we may be requesting certain very specific payroll records for a specific period of time. And ultimately, when we get down to the bottom of the decision tree or flowchart, if you will, the determination is finally made whether or not a material change in status occurred. And that's a term that we'll define as well. So we're tossing around some terms here: change in status, material change in status, nominal material. But overall, the purpose of the WCRB's analysis of a change in ownership, and if we have to review payroll records or if we need to request other information, the purpose is to answer the question, should the seller's payroll and claims data be used in the buyer's experience modification? So that's the purpose of this analysis. That's where we're going. The first step in the process is determine whether the change in ownership was nominal or material. And the definition of a material change in ownership is found in Section 4, Rule 1A of the Experience Rating Plan. And you can look that up when you get a chance. I won't read it to you. It's a little lengthy, but part of the analysis is determining whether there is a family relationship between the buyer and the seller. So family relationship plays an important role as well. Keep that in mind. Section 2, Rule 6 of the ERP defines immediate family members, and it's defined as father, mother, husband, wife, son, daughter, stepson, stepdaughter, grandson, or granddaughter. So if a change in ownership occurs only between immediate family members, then it's not a material change in ownership. Often this is referred to as a nominal change in ownership when a business transfers between family members. So what happens next when a change in ownership is nominal? Well, the payroll and claims experience of the seller is automatically used in the buyer's experience modification. For a nominal change in ownership, there's no need to continue the review. You don't go through the additional steps in the flowchart we just looked at. There's no review of payroll records. When it's a nominal change in ownership, the experience follows. There is a subsequent step potentially for a nominal change in ownership. We may go on to review combinability. So this is where the two major concepts kind of merge here. So try to keep them separate in your mind, though. There's combinability or combination of entities, and the other concept is a change in ownership. So after we've done the analysis of a change in ownership, then we may have to go on and say, okay, are the entities still combinable at that point? So we may have to do the subsequent combinability review. So we determine that for a nominal change, we determine that the experience follows the new owner. But if the buyer or the seller has other California operations, then the WCRB will review whether the entities remain combinable as a result of the change. So after the change, are they still combinable? If the entities are no longer combinable, they'll be separated, and the experience mod and the experience up to the date of the change in ownership will be used in the experience modifications for each entity. Some common examples of nominal changes in ownership include partnership splits, transfers of ownership interest to immediate family members. Those are the most common types of nominal changes where the entities may no longer be combinable, so they're separated out and the data is shared between the two files. So now let's discuss a material change in ownership. Material change in ownership is when the owners prior to the sale own less than 50% after the sale. So the first step is to determine the ownership for both entities before and after the change. Then we determine the percent change in ownership. So we ask what percent is owned by the new owners after the change. If the new owners own greater than 50% compared to the previous owners, then it's a material change in ownership. So if we determine that a material change in ownership occurred, we're not done yet. The next step is determine whether a material change in status occurred. So it's kind of a two-pronged review. Section 4, Rule 1 of the ERP defines a material change in status, but rather than reading that rule to you, I'll let you look that one up, and we'll take a look at the pieces here, which are kind of cited on this slide. So we'll look at the first part of the rule that states, experience of the past shall be used in future experience rating. So what does that mean? That means that if you buy a business in California, based on the rules of the experience rating plan, you will likely inherit the seller's experience modification. And that can be shocking to some. They're not aware that that's a possibility. There certainly are exceptions to every rule, and this rule has one as well. The exception to this rule begins with the word unless. So when is the seller's experience not used in the buyer's experience modification? It's when a material change in ownership is accompanied by a material change in either operations or employees. And we're going to go through that as well. Okay, so at this point, we want to emphasize that attempts should not be made to evade experience modifications. That's referred to as subterfuge, and it's taken very seriously. Any suspected cases of subterfuge where it seems that someone's trying to evade an unfavorable experience modification, they're investigated, and like I said, they're taken very seriously. So the purpose of this presentation today is to educate. It's important to know that when you buy a business in California, it's likely that you'll inherit the seller's experience modification, and so we want to make sure that that agents and brokers are aware of this and can communicate this to employers and policyholders. So, like I mentioned, there are exceptions to every rule, and the circumstances that are defined by the experience rating plan where the payroll and loss experience is not used in the buyer's experience modifications, these are referred to as material change in status. And they're not common, but we'll take you through how that analysis is done and how that determination is arrived at. So a material change, as I mentioned, a material change in status can result from either a material change in operations or a material change in employees. So let's start with material change in operations. What is that? Material change in operations involves a significant change to the process and exposure to hazard of the business within the first 90 days following the change in ownership. So this is not just a matter of adding guards to equipment or putting non-slip mats on the floors. This is a significant change, a substantial change to such an extent that it results in a reclassification by the WCRB. So something significant has changed with the business within the first 90 days, and the result is that you're actually reclassified. So we have to go out and do an inspection and determine that a new class code actually applies to you. You're a different business now based on that change. Now these are extremely rare. It's not common that people buy a business and transform it into something else. But it is one of the exceptions where the experience of the seller is not used in the buyer's experience modification. Okay, the more common type of a change in status is a material change in employees. So this determination requires that the WCRB review payroll records for both the buyer and the seller, and we determine whether first we have to determine whether or not the change in ownership was a total sale or a partial sale. And how do we do that? Well, ask the question, did the seller continue to maintain California operations after the sale? So if the answer is no, then it's a total sale. You bought all the California operations, that's a total sale. If the seller continues to maintain California operations after the sale, that's a partial sale. And it's important you differentiate at this point because different rules apply from the experience rating plan for a total sale versus a partial sale when we're doing this analysis of a change in ownership. Now, for a total sale, if a minority of the buyer's employees during the first 90 days also worked for the seller, and if a minority of the buyer's payroll was earned by the seller's employees, then a material change in status occurred. So essentially, you bought the business, it's a total sale, a majority of your employees are new during the first 90 days, and a majority of your total payroll during that 90-day period was generated by new employees. And this is not common. It's very uncommon to buy a business and to have a significant change in staff during the first 90 days. And it's not, this rule is not to encourage that kind of a change, certainly not. It's to find the exceptions where something substantial, something drastic has changed with the business so that it's no longer statistically credible for us to use the prior data. But for the most part, when a total sale occurs, the experience of the seller is going to carry forward and apply to the buyer. Okay, so let's look at a partial sale now and kind of compare and contrast because different rules apply. So if a buyer acquires, so for a partial sale, if the buyer acquired a majority of the seller's employees, or if the employees who transferred earn a majority of the seller's total payroll, then a material change in status did not occur and the seller's experience is used in the buyer's experience modification. However, if the acquired operations represent a minority of the seller's total employees and payroll, and payroll, it's important that it's both, then a material change in status occurred and the seller's experience is not used in the buyer's experience modification. And for a partial sale, it's just keep it in mind that we're looking at what portion of the seller's business was acquired. So did the buyer acquire a majority of the seller's employees or the employees who earn the most payroll, or did they just acquire a minority? If they acquired a minority of the total employees and the total payroll, then the experience mod would not carry forward. But if it's a majority, then the experience mod of the seller would be carried forward and applied to the buyers. So admittedly, these are probably the most challenging concepts when it comes to first learning about ownership, and we're just giving an introduction here today, so I don't want to overwhelm, but here's a recap of the differences between the two types of changes, the total sale versus the partial sale, kind of where we're focusing on. We're focusing on the buyer's side on a total sale and comparing to the seller's employees. And on the partial sale, we're focusing on the seller's side and asking what portion of the employees went on to work for the buyer. So it's a different focus, and again, a different set of rules from the experience rating plan apply. So the WCRB does all this analysis, and then what happens next is we will complete our review. We'll send a determination letter to the insurer to advise whether the change in ownership was nominal, material, to advise if there's any change in combinability or a change in status of any kind, the basis of the determination, and then what actions will be taken with the data and with the experience modifications as a result of the change. So here's what we discussed today. So hopefully you took away a few key points about determining ownership, about combination of entities, and then finally on changes in ownership and the analysis that goes into those. So we hope this presentation was helpful in getting a better understanding of ownership and the impact on experience modifications. This presentation, as well as other Education on Demand learning modules, are available on the WCRB website under the Learning Center. And we can open it up to any questions if Brian, if any have come in.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate this. This is a great topic, and anyone who's selling or servicing workers' comp, this is information that certainly impacts them on a daily basis. So this is great information. And like we said previously, we're going to go ahead and open up the webinar now for questions. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and type those into the toolbar on the right-hand side of the GoToMeeting. So we'll get a couple already in, and then we'll stand by for a few more. The first question is, how do you define ownership for not-for-profit corporations?
Great question. For a not-for-profit corporation. Okay, so let's actually go back here. Go back to some slide. Okay, so for not-for-profit corporation, not-for-profit association, we typically go to this rule, which is found under section, I want to say, section 2, rule 9 of the experience rating plan. So for a nonprofit corporation, if they have issued voting stock, then that's going to determine the ownership. If there's no voting stock, then we would go on to the second step, which is to say, are there members for that organization? If there are members, then the members own equal shares. If there's no voting stock and no members, then the board of directors are considered to be the owners for experience rating.
Perfect. Another quick question here. The person came a little late, but they asked you to, one more time, what is the change of ownership form that need to be filled out prior to this?
Great question. So the way to report a change in ownership to the WCRB is to have the insurer send the Form 601 to us. Certainly the agent or broker or even the employer can start filling it out, but we ask that the insurer or the insurance company will be the one to submit it to us to make sure that they're in the loop, that they're aware of any name change endorsements that need to be issued as a result of the change, anything like that that needs to change on the policy. But the Form 601 is available on our website. It's on WCRB.com. If you click on data reporting and then ownership changes, the form is there. You can fill that out. And you can either mail it to us, fax it to us, send it as an attachment in an email.
Okay. Next question was, how does the impact of PEOs work with experience modifications?
The impact, okay, let me make sure I understand the question. PEO is a pretty broad topic. A PEO is a professional employer organization, also referred to as a labor contractor. So when you say a PEO as it relates to experience rating, are we talking about a change in ownership? Are we talking about combination of entities?
Maybe we'll wait to get some clarification on that, but maybe you could briefly just kind of address how does PEOs impact someone's experience modification, or joining one, getting out of one, things like that.
Essentially, if you're under a labor contractor, then you're going to have a separate client policy. So, and there's some very specific rules about how that policy is written, whose name is in item 1 of the policy, which endorsements need to be attached to the policy. But essentially, you have to have your own separate client policy, and that policy is going to be in your file for experience rating, not the PEO's file.
Okay, hopefully that answers the question. Keep in mind, we're going to go ahead and be posting this webinar online again as well to review. And then, of course, if you have any questions, we'll be able to have you direct that either through the IIABCal or directly to Tim. We got time for just a couple more questions here. And this question, I can speak firsthand knowing how great the WCIRB is. I contact them on a regular basis. But the question is, if an agent comes across a situation that brings up more questions, is there someone that can help them through the process at the WCIRB?
Is there someone to help? Absolutely. We are here to help, Brian. We are here to help. We have an excellent customer service department. Anyone who's ever given them a call at 888-229-2472, you know that they provide excellent support. They can help walk you through that process. We're hoping by providing more of these educational presentations that employers and agents brokers will be able to self-serve a little more. We do receive about 100,000 calls each year, so we're trying to help people teach them to fish, essentially. But they're there to help, and that's certainly what they like to do and what the service that we want to provide to our customers. So you can either call or email them, and you can find that information on our website under Contact Us.
And I agree. I definitely have called them several times myself and always had a great experience. So we've gotten several questions here. We're going to have time for just a couple more. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and forward all these questions on to Tim, and we're going to get them answered, and we'll be able to post them and get some answers out because there's some great information. But keep in mind, Tim and as well as a couple other people from WCIRB will be at InsureFest being held in November, so we're going to make sure you sign up for that on November 6th through the 8th at the Sheraton Fisherman's Wharf. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll through here, and again, if your question was not answered, please let us know, and we'll get it forwarded on to the appropriate people, and we'll get it answered and sent back to you. We had great response, well over 75 people on this webinar, so thank you for that. A lot of questions, very individual regarding entities and things like that. This one here is the last one I see. If an individual passes away and a survivor's trust takes over ownership, does the experience carry over?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so I guess the first question to ask is does that meet the definition of a change in ownership? And actually, it does. So it's one of the 5 definitions that we have for a change in ownership. However, it's typically going to be that the experience follows. So we would look at, okay, what is the change? What was the ownership before and after? How is the trust set up? Did the grantor retain control? Is it debtor in possession? Likely it's going to be either a nominal or material change in ownership, but most of the time the experience is going to follow. There's typically not a material change in employees or operations that occurs at that time. So usually the experience will follow.
Great. And like I said, there's lots of questions, very specific in nature. So what we're going to have you do is if you have questions that were not answered today, go ahead and email us, the IIABCal. We'll forward it on to Tim, and he will absolutely get your questions answered for you. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. And I want to thank you again, Tim. Great information for spending time with us today. And to everyone out there, if you'd like to hear more on this subject, we will be presenting 2 additional workers' comp webinars, one on August 28th and one on October 2nd. And to register for those webinars or to download the recorded version of today's webinar, you want to visit www.insurefest.org and click on the Workers' Comp track link. In addition, Bill Mudge, President and CEO of the WCIRB, he's going to be one of our keynote speakers at InsureFest, like I said, November 6th to the 8th. and that's going to be held at the Sheraton Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. And Bill's going to be speaking on a great topic, which is becoming a customer-centric organization, so you definitely don't want to miss that. You can get all the information on InsureFest, all the speakers, dates, times, all that information is found at www.insurefest.org. So once again, Tim, thank you very much to you and to the WCRB for your partnership, and we look forward to speaking to you all again soon. Take care.
Thanks, Brian.